The man, worth $8 billion, sat hunched over a cup of lukewarm coffee, wearing clothes from a homeless shelter and nursing wounds from sleeping on concrete. Sarah Martinez didn't know any of this as she watched him from behind the diner's counter, counting her own tips from a slow Thursday night, exactly $27.13. Not enough for her overdue rent, but enough to cover the stranger's meal. She had seen that look before. The hollow eyes, the hesitation to order anything beyond water, the weight of invisible burdens. Something in her chest tightened as she watched him stare at the menu prices. In the fluorescent lights of Joe's all-night diner, she made a decision that would change both their lives forever. A simple act of kindness that would spiral into a story of hidden identities, danger, and a love that defied all expectations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The neon sign of Joe's all-night diner buzzed and flickered against the backdrop of a town, slowly losing its fight against time. Sarah wiped down the counter for the 100th time that night, her reflection fragmenting in the polished surface. The same surface her mother had cleaned 20 years ago, before arthritis claimed her hands and medical bills claimed their savings. "Order up!" Jerry's gruff voice called from the kitchen, the clatter of plates accompanying his words. Sarah grabbed the plate of scrambled eggs and toast, delivering it to the truck driver, who'd been fighting sleep in booth 3. She knew his type well. Lonely road warriors seeking comfort in fluorescent lights and bottomless coffee. "You're an angel, sweetheart," he mumbled, already reaching for the ketchup. Sarah managed a smile, though her feet ached from the 12-hour shift. The diner's ancient ceiling fan spun lazy circles above, doing little to disperse the heavy mix of coffee and grease that had seeped into every surface over decades. Her co-worker Ruby, an aging waitress with dyed red hair and stories from 3 marriages, shuffled past with a coffee pot. "Sugar, your section's got another one," she whispered, nodding toward the homeless man who'd just settled into booth 7. The same one Sarah had been watching earlier. Sarah touched the tips in her pocket, $27.13. The rent was due tomorrow, and her mother's prescription needed refilling. Mr. Patterson, her landlord, had already given her 2 extensions. His patience, like the town's prosperity, was wearing thin. She grabbed a menu and approached booth 7, studying the man more closely. Despite his ragged appearance, there was something different about him. His posture, perhaps, or the way his hands rested on the table, like someone trying to remember how to be someone else. "Coffee?" she offered, already reaching for the pot. He nodded, and she noticed his eyes, sharp and alert, despite the exhaustion evident in the dark circles beneath them. Not clouded by substances or defeat, like many of the homeless who found their way to Joe's. "Just coffee," he said quietly, his voice carrying an accent she couldn't quite place. Education lingered in those 2 words, incongruous with his worn clothes and unwashed hair. Sarah felt Ruby's eyes on her back as she poured his coffee. The diner's unspoken policy was clear. No lingering homeless customers. Bad for business, Jerry always said. But something made her pause, made her remember the nights her mother had brought home leftover pies for the family struggling after the factory closed. "Our soup today is vegetable beef," she found herself saying. "The cook always makes 2. Much. He'll just go to waste otherwise." A lie, but one she could cover with her tips. He looked up, and for a moment their eyes met. Something flickered there. Surprise, recognition of the kindness being offered, and something else. Pride, maybe. He opened his mouth as if to refuse, then seemed to think better of it. "Thank you," he said simply. "The soup would be nice." Sarah nodded and headed to the kitchen, ignoring Ruby's raised eyebrow. Through the serving window, she could see Jerry scowling at their latest customer. His thick arms crossed over his stained apron. "Just soup," she said before he could object. "I'll pay for it myself." Jerry's scowl deepened, but he reached for a bowl. Your heart's gonna break your bank account one of these days, kid. Sarah thought of her mother, of the collection notices, piling up on their kitchen table, of the years spent watching people's dreams wash away with each factory closure and foreclosure sign. Some things matter more than money, she said, though her empty bank account argued otherwise. As she carried the soup to booth 7, she noticed the man's hands again. Clean, despite his unwashed appearance, nails trimmed and maintained, small details that seemed out of place, like a puzzle piece that almost fit but didn't quite catch at the edges. She set the bowl down, along with a handful of crackers. "Enjoy," she said, turning away before he could see the fatigue in her smile. Behind her, the neon sign buzzed and flickered, casting alternating shadows and light across booth 7, where a billionaire in hiding watched a waitress walk away, unaware that her small act of kindness had just changed the course of both their lives. 48 hours earlier, Marcus Chen had stood in his penthouse office, watching his empire crumble through a wall of windows. 82 floors below, reporters swarmed the entrance of Chen Innovations headquarters like hungry wolves, their cameras flashing in the growing dusk. His phone buzzed again, the 70th call that hour. This time it was James, his CFO and supposed best friend of 15 years. Marcus let it ring. The betrayal still felt fresh, like a knife between his ribs. The documents on his desk told the story. Years of carefully orchestrated fraud, all designed to frame him, while billions disappeared into offshore accounts. "Mr. Chen," his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "The SEC agents are in the lobby. They have a warrant." Marcus closed his eyes, remembering his father's words from childhood. "Trust, once broken, shows you where the cracks were all along." He'd built his company from nothing, transforming a small tech startup into a global empire. Now, watching CNBC declare him the architect of the decade's biggest financial scandal, he realized success had made him soft, trusting. He opened his private safe, not for the emergency cash or passport, but for a weathered photograph. His parents on their small farm in California before cancer took them both. Their immigrant's dream had driven him, shaped him. "Integrity is everything," his father would say. "Money comes and goes. But your name? That's forever." The irony wasn't lost on him. His name was now splashed across every news channel, paired with words like fraud and conspiracy. But something didn't add up. The transactions, the timing, the perfectly crafted paper trail. It was too clean, like watching a magic trick and catching the moment of misdirection. Marcus took nothing but the photograph and the clothes on his back. The security footage would show him leaving through the private garage, but by then, he'd already vanished into the city's shadows. His plan was desperate, perhaps crazy, but he needed time. Time to think, to investigate, to understand who had orchestrated his downfall and why. He spent the first night in a homeless shelter, surrounded by the city's forgotten. No one looked twice at another well-educated man fallen from grace. These places were full of them. Former executives, lawyers, doctors who'd lost everything to addiction or bad luck. Here, his perfectly tailored suit was traded for donated clothes, his gold watch for a plastic digital one that beeped every hour. The second night, he'd caught a Greyhound bus heading west, paying cash. The man across the aisle read a newspaper, with Marcus's face on the front page, but nobody recognized him without the bespoke suits and carefully maintained image. It was amazing how invisible you became when you stepped off society's carousel. He chose the small town of Mill Creek randomly, drawn by its insignificance. The kind of place where news traveled slowly and strangers were still novel enough to be ignored rather than scrutinized. The diner had beckoned with its promise of warmth and anonymity. What he hadn't expected was kindness, real kindness, without agenda or expectation. He'd forgotten it existed. In his world, every gesture came with strings, every smile hid calculation. But the waitress, Sarah, he'd seen on her name tag, her kindness was pure. The way she'd looked at him, not through him or at what he represented, but at him as a person, had cracked something in his chest he thought had calcified years ago. Sitting in the diner now, warming his hands around the coffee cup, Marcus watched her move between tables. There was grace in her efficiency, dignity in the way she handled difficult customers. She reminded him of his mother, who'd cleaned houses to put him through college, who'd taught him that true worth had nothing to do with bank accounts. The soup appeared before him, steam rising in the fluorescent light. A simple act of generosity that somehow meant more than all the charitable donations and foundation galas in his previous life. As he watched Sarah return to her duties, Marcus made a decision. He'd stay in Mill Creek, at least for a while. Something told him the answers he sought might be found here, in this unlikely place where kindness still existed without ulterior motives. What he didn't know then was that this decision would not only change his life, but would set in motion events that would expose a conspiracy larger than he imagined, and test whether love born of genuine connection could survive the weight of lies and the shadows of his past. Sarah's ancient Corolla protested as she turned onto Cedar Street, the engine coughing like it shared her exhaustion. Dawn painted Mill Creek in shades of gray, the kind of light that made everything look tired and worn. She passed Thompson's Hardware, its windows now covered with "going out of business" signs. Another casualty of the mega store that had opened 30 miles down the highway. The morning paper hit her front porch just as she pulled into the driveway. "Perfect timing, Jimmy," she called to the teenager on his bike. He waved back, nearly losing his balance. His father had lost his job at the factory 2 years ago. The paper route was helping keep their lights on. Inside her small rental house, Sarah found her mother already awake, sitting in her favorite armchair by the window. Elena Martinez had once been the town's most sought-after seamstress, her fingers, working magic with needle and thread. Now those same fingers, twisted by arthritis, struggled to hold her morning tea. "You're late, mija," Elena said, her eyes sharp despite her frail appearance. "The mysterious homeless man again," Sarah smiled, setting down her bag. "You should be sleeping, Mama. Sleep is for the young. Tell me about him." Elena had always been too perceptive for Sarah's own good. "There's something different about this one, isn't there?" Sarah busied herself with organizing her mother's morning pills. "He's just someone who needed help," she said. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't entirely true. There had been something about him, something that nagged at her thoughts during the long drive home, like that stray cat you brought home when you were 7. Elena's eyes twinkled. "The one that turned out to be Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning Persian?" "That was different," Sarah laughed, the sound echoing in their small living room. "The walls needed painting, and the carpet had seen better days, but they'd made this house a home after selling their old place to pay for Eleanor's first round of treatments." Through the window, Sarah watched Mr. Patterson, their landlord, walking. His dog passed their house. His eyes lingered on their overgrown lawn, and Sarah added it to her mental list of things to tackle during her precious few hours between shifts. The list kept growing, like weeds through concrete. "I saw Carol at the pharmacy yesterday," Elena said carefully, watching her daughter's face. "She mentioned there's an opening at the bank. Regular hours, benefits." "Mama, we've talked about this." Sarah lined up the pills. White for pain, blue for inflammation, yellow for blood pressure. The rainbow of their financial strain. The diner's tips are better and the schedule lets me be here when you need me. What she didn't say was that she'd already tried the bank route. They'd wanted a college degree, something she'd had to abandon when Elena first got sick. The diner didn't care about degrees, only that she showed up on time and kept the coffee flowing. From somewhere in town, a train whistle echoed. The 6:45 freight train that no longer stopped here. Mill Creek had once been a railway hub, busy, with commerce and promise. Now the trains just passed through, like everything else. Sarah's phone buzzed, a text from Ruby. "Jerry wants you to come in early tonight. Linda called in sick again." "You need to sleep," Elena protested, seeing Sarah's expression. "Sleep is for the young, remember?" Sarah kissed her mother's forehead. Besides, extra hours mean extra tips. She headed to her room, passing the wall of family photos. Her father in his Marine uniform before the accident. Elena at her sewing machine, surrounded by beautiful fabrics. Sarah at her high school graduation, still believing she'd be the first in her family to finish college. As she changed for bed, Sarah caught her reflection in the mirror. At 28, she was already developing the same worry lines her mother had worn at that age. But beneath the exhaustion, something else flickered in her eyes today, a spark of curiosity, maybe hope, ignited by a stranger's unexpected presence in their predictable town. From her window, she could see the distant outline of the abandoned factory, its skeleton, a reminder of better days. But today, watching the morning light paint the sky, Sarah felt something shift, like the first tremor before an earthquake, or the subtle change in air pressure before a storm. She didn't know it yet, but in 12 hours she'd returned to the diner to find the mysterious stranger had applied for their vacant dishwasher position. In that small-town earthquake she sensed coming, it was just the beginning. Marcus found the receipt crumpled in his jacket pocket the next morning while sitting on a park bench watching Mill Creek wake up. He'd almost thrown it away, but something made him smooth out the wrinkled paper. That's when he saw it, the handwritten note at the bottom. Meal comp, Sarah M. He stared at those 3 words, remembering the last time someone had done something for him without expecting anything in return. It had been years, maybe decades. In his world, every gesture came with a price tag. Every favor demanded repayment, with interest. The morning sun cast long shadows across the town square as he watched workers shuffle into Carson's coffee shop, the only chain store that had survived in downtown Mill Creek. A newspaper stand caught his eye. His own face stared back at him from the front page, alongside headlines about the growing scandal. He looked different now. 5 days of stubble and exhaustion had transformed him from corporate titan to invisible man. His fingers traced the receipt's edges. $27.13 had been deducted from the total, marked as an employee discount. He'd seen her counting tips, noticed how she calculated each bill with careful precision. This wasn't spare change to her. It was groceries, gas money, maybe part of her rent. A police car cruised past, and Marcus instinctively ducked his head. But the officer was focused on his coffee, another face in the stream of morning routines. In this forgotten town, Marcus had found something he'd lost long ago: anonymity, the freedom to simply exist without the weight of expectations and appearances. He made his way back to the diner, arriving just as the breakfast rush was ending. Through the window, he could see Sarah refilling coffee cups, her movements efficient but gentle. She looked tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion he recognized from his early days building his company. The help wanted sign in the window seemed like destiny, or maybe just desperate logic. He needed to stay hidden, to figure out who had framed him and why. He needed income that couldn't be traced, a reason to remain in one place without drawing attention. Most of all, though he wouldn't admit it yet, he needed to understand why a stranger's simple act of kindness had affected him so deeply. The bell chimed as he pushed open the door. Sarah looked up, surprise flickering across her face. This time, he was cleaner. He'd used the truck stop shower, trimmed his beard. The clothes were still from the shelter, but carefully washed. "I saw your sign," he said, gesturing to the window. "I have experience washing dishes." A lie, but how hard could it be? He'd built a tech empire from scratch. Surely he could handle a commercial dishwasher. Jerry, the cook, emerged from the kitchen, arms crossed. "Experience where?" Marcus had prepared. For this. Small places, moving around. I can start immediately." He could feel Sarah watching him, sense her curiosity. "Got any ID?" Jerry asked. "Lost it. But I can work for cash, less than minimum wage." He knew how to speak their language now. Desperation and necessity, the universal currency of the invisible. Jerry's eyes narrowed, calculating. The diner needed help, and cheap labor was cheap labor. Trial basis. You screw up, you're out. Marcus nodded, feeling Sarah's receipt burn in his pocket like a talisman. As Jerry disappeared into the kitchen to get paperwork, Sarah approached with a coffee pot. "Welcome aboard," she said, filling a cup he hadn't asked for. "I'm Sarah. James," he replied, using his middle name. Another lie, but a necessary one. Their eyes met, and for a moment he saw something there. Recognition, not of who he was, but of something deeper. Two souls carrying weights they couldn't share. The coffee was bitter and perfect, like the irony of a billionaire finding salvation in minimum wage dishes. But as he watched Sarah return to her duties, Marcus realized he'd found something else too, a purpose beyond survival. He would repay her kindness, not with money. He couldn't access his accounts anyway, but with something more valuable, the truth. Eventually, steam billowed around Marcus as he stood at the industrial sink, his hands red from the scalding water. 3 hours into his first shift, and he'd already broken 2 plates, flooded the floor once, and earned a string of colorful curses from Jerry. For someone who'd once orchestrated billion-dollar mergers, the commercial dishwasher was proving to be a surprisingly worthy adversary. "You're loading it wrong," Sarah's voice came from behind him. She reached around, rearranging the dishes in the rack. "See, the water needs to hit them at the right angle." Her arm brushed his, and he felt an unexpected jolt of electricity at the contact. The small TV mounted in the corner suddenly caught his attention. His company's logo flashed across the screen, followed by his corporate headshot. Marcus ducked. Behind the machine, heart pounding. "You okay?" Sarah asked, frowning at his sudden movement. "Just avoiding the splash," he managed, listening intently to the news anchor's voice. Still no sign of CEO Marcus Chen as investigations into the $8 billion fraud deepen. Sources close to the investigation suggest Chen may have fled the country. "Terrible, isn't it?" Sarah shook her head, wiping her hands on her apron. "All that money and still not enough. Makes you wonder about people." Marcus focused on scrubbing a particularly stubborn pot, his knuckles white around the scouring pad. "Maybe there's more to the story," he said carefully. "There always is." She smiled, and he noticed a small dimple in her left cheek. "But at least our drama here is smaller scale. Though you should know, Ruby's convinced you're either a serial killer or an escaped cult member." He forced a laugh, but his mind was racing. If Ruby was already speculating about his past, how long before others started asking questions? He needed to be more careful, more ordinary. The dinner rush hit like a tsunami. Marcus fell into a rhythm, letting the mindless work occupy his hands while his thoughts wandered to his investigation. James, his CFO, had been the public face of the accusations, but the paper trail had been too perfect, too comprehensive. Someone else had to be pulling the strings. "Order up!" Jerry's voice boomed over the clatter of dishes. Marcus glanced through the serving window, watching Sarah juggle 4 plates with practiced ease. She moved differently than the corporate waitstaff he was used to. No artificial smile, no rehearsed phrases, just genuine warmth and quiet efficiency. "Hey, James," she called during a lull, leaning against the doorframe to the kitchen. "Some of us grab coffee at Carson's after shift. Want to join?" The invitation was casual, friendly, normal. Everything his life wasn't supposed to be right now. "I should probably rest," he said reluctantly. "Early start tomorrow." She nodded, understanding in her eyes. Another time then. As she walked away, Marcus noticed Jerry watching him with narrowed eyes. "You don't talk much about yourself," the cook said, crossing his arms. "Not much to tell," Marcus replied, turning back to his dishes. But he could feel Jerry's gaze lingering, questioning. Another person to be careful around. The shift ended. At midnight, as Marcus hung up his apron, Sarah appeared with a takeout container. "Leftover pie," she said. "Can't let it go to waste." Their fingers brushed as she handed him the container. And again he felt that strange spark in her eyes. He saw something that both thrilled and terrified him, the beginning of trust. Trust he didn't deserve, built on lies he couldn't take back. Walking to his rented room above the hardware store, Marcus passed the town's only newsstand. Tomorrow's papers were being delivered, and there was his face again, alongside new allegations and theories about his disappearance. Standing in the pool of light from a flickering street lamp, holding Sarah's pie in one hand and his false identity in the other, Marcus realized he was walking a tightrope that was getting thinner by the day. The diner felt different after midnight, when the last truckers had gone and the fluorescent lights hummed in harmony with the ancient coffee maker. Sarah sat at the counter, counting out her tips, while Marcus finished the last rack of dishes. 2 weeks had passed since he'd started, and they'd fallen into a comfortable routine of late-night conversations. "You do that the same way every night," Marcus observed, watching her sort bills by denomination with methodical precision. "Mom taught me. She used to say, 'Money's like time. You need to know exactly what you have to know what you can afford to spend.'" Sarah stacked another $5 bill, her movements automatic. "Though lately, it feels like I don't have enough of either." Marcus dried his hands, fighting the urge to reach for his hidden emergency cash. In his former life, he could have solved her financial problems with a single phone call. Now, he was living on cash-only wages himself, trying to piece together who had orchestrated his downfall while washing dishes in a small-town diner. "Tell me about your dream cafe," he said instead, having noticed how her eyes lit up whenever she mentioned it. Sarah smiled, abandoning her counting. "It would be nothing fancy, just a place where people could feel at home, you know? Good coffee, fresh pastries, maybe some of my mom's old recipes." She gestured around the diner. "I love this place, but you want something that's yours." Marcus finished, understanding completely. He'd felt the same way once, before Chen Innovations grew into something beyond his control. "Exactly." She pulled out a small notebook from her apron, its corners worn from frequent handling. "I've got it all planned out. The menu, the decor, even the perfect location. That old bookstore on Maple Street that's been empty forever." She showed him her careful drawings and calculations, years of dreams condensed into graph paper and margins. Marcus studied her numbers with the eye of someone who'd built a fortune from scratch. Her business plan was surprisingly solid, conservative even. "These projections are good," he said, forgetting himself for a moment. "Though you might want to factor in higher initial equipment costs." Sarah gave him a curious look. "You know a lot about business for a dishwasher." He recovered quickly. "Used to date someone in restaurant management." Another lie to add to the growing pile. A comfortable silence fell between them as Sarah returned to her counting and Marcus wiped down the kitchen. Through the windows, they could see the occasional car pass by, headlights sweeping across the worn linoleum floor. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said suddenly, her voice quiet. "Why did you really come to Mill Creek?" Marcus paused, his back to her. "Looking for a fresh start, I guess." "From what?" He turned to face her, seeing genuine concern in her eyes. For a moment he was tempted to tell her everything about the betrayal, the frame-up, the late nights piecing together who might have orchestrated his downfall. Instead, he said, "Sometimes you have to lose everything to figure out what matters." Sarah nodded, understanding in her expression. "When Dad died, Mom kept saying something similar. Life has a way of stripping you down to your foundation to show you what you're really built on." The truth of her words hit him hard. What was his foundation now? His entire identity had been built on success, on being Marcus Chen, the tech billionaire who never failed. Now, as James the dishwasher, he was learning who he was without the money, without the power. And somehow, this waitress with her careful dreams and quiet strength saw something in him worth knowing. "Your soup's getting cold," she said softly, nodding to the bowl she'd set aside for him earlier. It had become their ritual, sharing a late dinner after closing, talking about everything and nothing. As they sat together in the quiet diner, Marcus realized he was no longer just playing a role. Somewhere between the dirty dishes and midnight conversations, he'd found something real, something that made him question whether he wanted his old life back at all. But as Sarah smiled at him over her coffee cup, he knew the choice wouldn't be his to make. Sooner or later, his past would catch up, and when it did, these precious moments of normalcy would shatter like the plates he'd broken on his first day. The laptop screen glowed in Marcus's darkened room above the hardware store, its light reflecting off his tense features. He'd borrowed the device from the public library's Lost and Found, needing a secure way to check his private email server. What he found made his blood run cold. Someone had accessed his offshore accounts, emergency funds even his lawyers didn't know about. Whoever had framed him was still hunting, still erasing his safety nets. They were getting closer. A knock at his door made him slam the laptop shut. "James, you in there?" Sarah's voice. His heart rate slowly returned to normal. "Just a minute," he called, quickly hiding the computer under his mattress. She stood in the hallway looking smaller than usual, worry etched across her face. "Sorry to bother you on your day off, but Jerry's short-staffed and I wondered—" "I'll be there in 10 minutes, he said without hesitation. The diner was chaos when they arrived. The afternoon rush had hit early, and Ruby had called in sick. Marcus moved seamlessly between dishes and bussing tables, skills he'd somehow acquired over the past month. He was lifting a tub of dirty dishes when he heard a familiar voice that made him freeze. Just passing through town, stopping for coffee. Marcus dared a glance. Thomas Wright, his former head of security, sat at the counter. The man who'd spent years protecting Marcus now had a $100,000 bounty out for information on his whereabouts. Sarah approached Thomas with her usual warm smile. "Coffee it is. Anything else?" Marcus ducked into the kitchen, heart pounding. Through the serving window, he could see Thomas scanning the diner with professional interest. "Old habits died hard. Heard anything about that tech billionaire who went missing?" Thomas asked Sarah casually. "Guy named Marcus Chen?" "We're following leads in the area." Sarah shrugged, refilling his cup. "Only what's on the news? Seems like a sad story. All that money, and he still had to run." "Yeah, sad story," Thomas agreed, but his eyes were sharp. "Mind if I post these in your window?" He pulled out a stack of wanted posters. Marcus's recent photo stared back from the paper, alongside promises of reward money. Money that could change someone's life. Money that could save a struggling diner or help pay for medical treatments. "Sure, I'll put them up," Sarah said, taking the posters. Marcus watched her study his photo, saw the slight furrow of her brow. Did she see the resemblance? Would the promise of reward money override whatever friendship they'd built? The kitchen door swung open. "James, need you out front," Jerry called. "Sarah's got a family emergency." Marcus emerged cautiously, keeping his head down. Thomas was leaving already on his phone. Sarah stood by the register, her face pale as she read a letter. "Everything okay?" Marcus asked softly, approaching her. "Insurance denied Mom's new treatment," she whispered. "And Mr. Patterson's selling the house. We have 30 days to move." Her hands trembled as she folded the letter. I can't." Without thinking, Marcus reached for her hand. "Breathe. We'll figure something out." She looked up at him, and for a moment he thought he saw recognition flicker in her eyes as she glanced between him and the wanted poster. But then Jerry called for more coffee, and the moment passed. That evening after closing, Marcus watched Sarah hang the wanted posters in the window. His own face stared back at him, a ghost from another life. $100,000, enough to save her mother, to keep their home, to start her cafe. Weird to think he's out there somewhere, Sarah mused, adjusting the poster. Running from his old life. Maybe he had good reasons, Marcus said carefully. Sarah turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Everyone has reasons, James. But it's our choices that show who we really are." She gathered her things, exhaustion evident in every movement. "See you tomorrow?" Marcus nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Later, alone in his room, he stared at his reflection in the cracked mirror. Sarah's words echoed in his mind. Choices that show who we really are. His phone buzzed, a burner he'd bought for emergencies. The text was from an unknown number. Found. You. Time was running out. Soon he'd have to choose, run again or trust Sarah with the truth. Either way, he knew someone's heart would break. Rain drummed against the diner's windows as Sarah and Marcus sat in their usual spots after closing. The wanted posters, now rain-streaked, cast distorted shadows across their faces. Marcus couldn't help but notice how Sarah's hands shook as she tried to wrap silverware, the usual neat bundles coming undone. "You should go home, get some rest," he suggested, knowing she'd been pulling double shifts all week. "Can't." Her voice cracked slightly. "Mom's at the hospital again. They say it's just for observation," but she trailed off, a fork clattering to the floor. When she bent to retrieve it, he saw the tears she was trying to hide. Marcus moved without thinking, pulling her into a gentle embrace. She stiffened for a moment, then melted against him, her composure finally breaking. "I don't know what to do anymore," she whispered against his shoulder. "The new treatment cost more than we could make in 2 years. Mr. Patterson's already got people looking at the house, and I just—" Her voice caught. "I can't lose her too." The weight of his secret pressed against him like a physical thing. One phone call, one revelation of his identity. He could solve all her problems with a single signature. The words rose in his throat. "Sarah, I'm not who you think I am." But before he could speak, the diner's door chimed. They jumped apart as a group of truckers came in, shaking off the rain. Sarah quickly wiped her eyes and reached for her order pad, professional mask sliding back into place. Marcus watched her work, her quiet strength showing in every careful smile, every gentle interaction with customers who had no idea she was breaking inside. He remembered his mother doing the same, serving wealthy clients with grace while medical bills piled up at home. Later, as the truckers left and they began closing again, Sarah spoke softly. "Mom used to say that grief comes in waves, that after Dad died, she'd think she was fine, and then something small would happen, finding his coffee mug in the cupboard, hearing his favorite song, and it would all crash back." She smiled sadly. "I think fear works the same way." Marcus thought of the text message on his burner phone, of Thomas's searching eyes. "Yeah, it does." "Can I tell you something?" Sarah asked, sitting beside him at the counter. "Something I haven't told anyone else?" He nodded, though guilt churned in his stomach. "I've been having these dreams," she continued. "I'm a little girl again, and Dad's teaching me to swim. He's telling me to trust him, that he won't let go. But then the water gets deep and I'm alone, and Mom's calling for help, but I can't reach her." She took a shaky breath. "I wake up feeling like I'm still drowning." Marcus reached for her hand, remembering similar nightmares after his own parents died. "You're not alone, Sarah." She squeezed his hand, and the simple trust in that gesture felt like both a gift and a knife to his heart. "I know, that's why—" She hesitated. "That's why I need to tell you something else, about the wanted posters." His pulse quickened. "What about them?" "I've been staring at that photo, trying to figure out why it seemed familiar." She turned to face him fully. "There's something I need to ask." The kitchen door swung open as Jerry emerged. "Sarah, your mother's nurse is on the phone. Says it's urgent." The color drained from Sarah's face as she rushed to take the call. Marcus stood frozen, caught between the need to comfort her and the fear of what she'd been about to ask. Through the serving window he could see her nodding, tears streaming down her face. When she returned, her eyes were red but determined. "Mum's being moved to intensive care. I have to go." "Let me drive you," Marcus offered. But she shook her head. "No, I need to do this alone. But James—" She paused at the door. "Tomorrow. We need to talk tomorrow." After she left, Marcus sat in the empty diner, staring at his reflection in the dark windows. The man looking back was neither Marcus Chen, billionaire, nor James the dishwasher. He was someone in between, someone who'd found something real in a life built on lies. He pulled out his burner phone, looking at the threatening text again. Then, with shaking hands, he dialed a number he'd memorized years ago. "It's me," he said when the line connected. "I need you to wire money to Mill Creek. General Hospital, anonymous donor. Make it enough to cover any treatment they have." He paused. "And I need you to find out who's been accessing my private accounts. It's time to end this." As he hung up, thunder rolled overhead, and his wanted poster finally broke free from the window, carried away by the wind and rain. A sign, perhaps, that tomorrow would bring either salvation or destruction. Either way, the time for lies was ending. The black SUV, parked outside the diner, stood out like a shark in a goldfish pond. Through the serving window, Marcus watched two men in expensive suits slide into a booth, their casual demeanor betrayed by alert eyes that scanned every face in the room. He recognized their type, private investigators, high-end ones, the kind his company used to hire. "Your regulars?" Jerry asked, noticing Marcus's tense posture. "Never seen them before," Marcus muttered, ducking back into the kitchen. But he knew exactly who they were. The text message hadn't been a bluff. They really had found him. Sarah was at the hospital with her mother, who'd stabilized after a mysterious anonymous donation covered her new treatment. Ruby had taken her section, approaching the investigators with her usual mix of charm and nosiness. "We're looking for information about Marcus Chen," one of them said, loud enough for Marcus to hear through the kitchen door. "Word is he might have passed through here. That missing billionaire?" Ruby's voice carried her excitement. "Honey, if he'd been here, I'd have remembered. Though now that you mention it..." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "We did get a mysterious new dishwasher about a month ago." Marcus's hands froze in the soapy water. Ruby had been joking, but he saw the investigators exchange glances. One of them pulled out a laptop, and Marcus knew what would come next: facial recognition software, database searches, the full arsenal of modern manhunting tools. His burner phone vibrated in his pocket. The message was from his old security. "Chief, get out now. They're not PIs, they're working for James." Marcus felt the walls closing in. James, his former CFO, must have figured out he was gathering evidence. These men weren't here to find him. They were here to silence him. The kitchen's back door beckoned. He could slip out now, disappear again. He'd done it before, but Sarah would return to an empty kitchen, another person vanishing from her life without explanation. And if these men were truly dangerous, the diner itself could become a target. The bell above the door chimed. Marcus's heart stopped as he heard Sarah's voice. "Ruby, you won't believe what happened. Mum's treatment is working, and somehow all our bills were..." She stopped, probably noticing the investigators. Marcus reached for his phone again, dialing quickly. "It's me," he whispered. "Are the files secured?" "Uploaded and time-stamped," his security chief confirmed. "Enough evidence to prove the fraud was orchestrated by James and the board. FBI is standing by." "How long to move?" 20 minutes to... "Your location?" Marcus took a deep breath. 20 minutes. He could disappear in 2. But as he heard Sarah's voice again, talking about her mother's miracle recovery, he made a different choice. He stepped out of the kitchen just as one of the investigators was asking Sarah about the wanted poster. Their eyes met across the diner, and in that moment, he saw recognition dawn in her face, not from the poster, but from a deeper truth she'd probably known for days. "Actually," Marcus said loudly, making every head turn, "I can help you with your investigation." The investigators stood quickly, hands moving toward concealed weapons. But Marcus kept his eyes on Sarah, silently pleading for understanding. "My name is Marcus Chen," he continued, "and I can prove that James Davidson and 3 board members conspired to frame me for fraud while embezzling billions through offshore accounts." The diner fell silent. Ruby's coffee pot crashed to the floor, and Sarah just stood there, her face a complicated mix of emotions he couldn't read. "Sir," one investigator said, reaching into his jacket, "you need to come with us." "I don't think so," Marcus replied calmly, noting the man's telltale stance. "Because real private investigators don't carry that model of Glock, and they definitely don't work for corrupt CFOs." As if on cue, sirens wailed in the distance. The investigators exchanged panicked looks, their cover blown. One of them grabbed for his gun, but before he could draw it, a pot of hot coffee, Ruby's specialty, splashed across their table. In the chaos that followed, as FBI vehicles screeched into the parking lot and the investigators tried to flee, Marcus found himself staring at Sarah. In her eyes, he saw hurt, confusion, and something else, a question waiting to be answered. The time for running was over. Now he had to face a different kind of judgment, one that mattered more than any, court or public opinion. He had to explain himself to the woman who'd seen him at his most honest while believing a lie. The FBI had cleared the diner, but chaos lingered in the air like the scent of Ruby's spilled coffee. Sarah stood by the counter, her fingers tracing the edge of the wanted poster she'd hung herself just days ago. Marcus, not James, she reminded. Herself watched her from across the room, maintaining a careful distance. The hospital bills, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. That was you? He nodded, taking a tentative step forward. I couldn't just... Don't. The word cut through the air between them. Don't tell me what you couldn't do. You've been lying to me for weeks. Outside, federal agents were leading the fake investigators away in handcuffs. News vans were already starting to arrive, their lights painting the street in alternating red and blue. Soon the whole world would know that Marcus Chen had been found in a small-town diner. I wanted to tell you, Marcus started again, but Sarah's laugh, sharp and bitter, stopped him. When? After I spilled my heart out to you, after I trusted you with everything? She turned to face him fully, and the hurt in her eyes made him step back. Do you know what it's like to pray for a miracle while watching your mother suffer? To count every penny and still come up short? Of course you don't. You could have helped at any time. It wasn't that simple, Marcus protested. The people after me, they're dangerous. I was trying to protect me? Sarah's voice rose. By letting me think I'd found someone who actually understood. Someone real. She grabbed her bag from behind the counter, hands shaking. I have to get back to the hospital. Sarah, please. Marcus moved to block her path. Yes, I lied about my name, about my past, but everything else, every conversation, every moment, that was real, more real than anything in my old life. For a moment, something flickered in Sarah's eyes, a softening. Then her phone buzzed. Looking at the message, her face went pale. Mom's asking for me, she said, all the anger draining from her voice, replaced by fear. Her fever's back. Let me drive you, Marcus offered, reaching for her arm. She jerked away. I think you've done enough. But as she moved toward the door, her legs buckled slightly. Marcus caught her before she could fall, and for a brief moment, she let herself lean against him. He could feel her trembling. You must have laughed, she whispered, watching me count tips, worry about bills, dream about that stupid cafe. All while you could have bought this whole town without blinking, Sarah. He turned her gently to face him. The night you paid for my meal, no one had shown me that kind of kindness in years. Real kindness, expecting nothing in return. You saw me when I was invisible. That meant everything. Tears spilled down her cheeks. I saw James the dishwasher, a good man who understood struggle, not some billionaire playing poor. Playing poor? Now Marcus's voice rose. You think I was playing? I was fighting for my life, trying to expose the people who destroyed everything I built. But here, with you, for the first time in years, I remembered who I was before the money. Before Marcus Chen became a name that belonged to shareholders and board members. A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the windows they could see reporters gathering, cameras pointed at the diner. Your world's back, Sarah said, quietly, pulling away from him. You should go, they're waiting for their prodigal billionaire. I don't care about them. Marcus reached for her hand. The only person I care about is walking away from me. Sarah stared at their joined hands. My mother is sick, possibly dying. I can't deal with this right now, with you, with any of it. Then let me help, not with money. Just let me be there, the way you were there for me. For a long moment, Sarah said nothing. Then finally, I need time. To think, to process. She pulled her hand away. And my mother needs me. As she walked toward the door, Marcus called out, "The cafe on Maple Street. I meant what I said about your business plan being solid." Sarah paused, her hand on the door handle. "Goodbye, Marcus," she said softly, and stepped out into the chaos of cameras and questions, leaving him alone in the diner where a waitress had once shown kindness to a stranger and changed both their lives forever. Mill Creek Hospital's waiting room television blared with breaking news. Sarah stared at the screen, watching Marcus, perfectly groomed now, wearing a suit that probably cost more than her car, addressing a crowd of reporters outside the FBI field office. The dishwasher's slouch was gone, replaced by the confident posture of a man used to commanding rooms. "All evidence has been submitted to the authorities," he was saying, his voice smooth and practiced. "The conspiracy to frame me involved multiple board members and—" Sarah turned away, focusing instead on her mother's latest test results. Elena's fever had stabilized, but the doctors were concerned about infection risks. The new treatment was working, they said, but recovery would take time. Time that, thanks to Marcus's anonymous donation, they could now afford. "That's him, isn't it?" Elena asked from her hospital bed, eyes fixed on the television. "Your James?" "He was never my James, Mama." Sarah adjusted her mother's blankets, avoiding the screen. "He was never really James at all." "No?" Elena's knowing smile made Sarah pause. "The way he looked at you when he thought no one was watching, that was real enough." A nurse entered with Elena's evening medication, her eyes darting between Sarah and the television. Word had spread quickly that Mill Creek's mysterious dishwasher was the missing billionaire. Sarah could feel the nurse's curious stare, could practically hear the questions forming. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing since the story broke. Ruby had texted 14 times, each message more excitable than the last. Local news wanted interviews. Even Mr. Patterson had called, suddenly very flexible about their housing situation. "Miss Martinez." A man in a suit appeared in the doorway. "I'm David Cooper, Mr. Chen's attorney. May we speak privately?" Sarah felt her mother squeeze her hand. "Whatever you have to say, you can say it here." The lawyer nodded, closing the door. "Mr. Chen wanted me to ensure you understand that all hospital expenses will continue to be covered. He's also prepared to—" "To what?" Sarah interrupted, anger flaring. "Buy my forgiveness? Pay me to keep quiet about his little adventure in poverty tourism?" "Sarah," Eleanor warned softly. "Mr. Chen," the lawyer continued smoothly, "wants you to know that the cafe on Maple Street is available. He's arranged for the purchase and renovation, with full ownership to be transferred to you. No strings attached." Sarah felt the room spin slightly. The cafe, her dream, gifted like a trinket from a billionaire's pocket. "Get out!" "Miss Martinez, I said get out." Her voice cracked. "Tell your boss that not everything can be fixed with money. Some things, like trust and truth, actually matter to regular people like us." After the lawyer left, Elena sighed. "Mia, pride is a luxury we cannot afford." "It's all I have left," Sarah whispered, but her mother shook her head. "No, what you have is someone who cares enough to try making things right, even if he's doing it badly." On the television, Marcus was still speaking, but his polished veneer had cracked slightly. "I learned something important during my time away," he was saying, his voice softer now. "The true measure of a person isn't in their bank account or social status. It's in the kindness they show to strangers, the dignity with which they face struggles, the dreams they—" He paused, seeming to look directly into the camera. "The dreams they refuse to abandon, no matter how impossible they seem." Sarah's phone buzzed again. An unknown number, but she knew who it was. "The lawyer was a mistake. I'm sorry. Can we talk? Just us?" Elena reached for the remote, muting the television. "You know, your father used to say that sometimes people come into our lives disguised as what we need, only to reveal themselves as who we need. That doesn't even make sense, Mama, doesn't it? Elena smiled. A billionaire learns humility from a waitress. A waitress learns her dreams aren't too big from a dishwasher. Maybe the disguises were necessary for the lessons. Sarah looked at her mother's knowing expression, then back at her phone. Another message had appeared. I'm not asking you to forgive me. Just to remember that the person you knew, the one who washed dishes and listened to your dreams and saw how amazing you are, that person is real. He's the most real I've ever been. Outside the hospital window, a crowd of reporters had gathered, hoping to catch the first interview with the woman who'd unknowingly sheltered Marcus Chen. But Sarah barely noticed them. She was too busy thinking about a different crowd, the regular people who came to Joe's diner every day, seeking not just food, but connection, understanding, humanity, the same things a billionaire had found there, disguised as a dishwasher. Mama, she said finally, what would you do? Eleanor's smile widened. I'd remember that second chances, like kindness, work both ways. The conference room at the FBI field office hummed with tension as Marcus laid out the evidence. Sarah sat in the back, still unsure why she'd accepted his request to be here. Agent Williams spread photographs across the table. Marcus's former CFO James Davidson shaking hands with a known money launderer. Encrypted emails recovered from hidden servers, wire transfers traced to shell companies. It wasn't just about money, Marcus explained, his voice tired. They needed me gone because I was about to launch a free healthcare AI system, something that would have disrupted billion-dollar healthcare companies. Companies where my board members had massive investments. Sarah thought of her mother's medical bills, of all the families in Mill Creek struggling with healthcare costs. A system that could have helped them, destroyed by greed. Davidson orchestrated everything. Agent Williams added, used Chen's personal credentials to authorize transfers, backdated documents, even hired actors to create false evidence of meetings that never happened. But he got sloppy, left traces. Traces you found while washing dishes in a diner, Sarah said quietly, speaking for the first time. All eyes turned to her. Marcus met her gaze. I had help. My old security chief was gathering evidence, but we needed time. Time I found in Mill Creek, at the diner. With you, his eyes seemed to say. Agent Williams clicked through surveillance photos on a screen. Davidson's team followed false leads across 3 continents. Never imagined you'd hide somewhere so ordinary. Not ordinary, Marcus corrected, still looking at Sarah. Real. A junior agent burst in, waving a tablet. Sir, Davidson's trying to run private plane at the regional airport. And the money trail? Marcus asked sharply. Confirmed. 8 billion transferred through crypto networks. He was bleeding the company dry while framing you. Sarah watched Marcus's face, saw the same quiet strength she'd known in James the dishwasher, the man who'd scrubbed pots while secretly fighting to expose corruption that affected millions. The healthcare AI, she found herself asking, could it really help people like my mom? It already is, Marcus replied softly. I never stopped development. Been running it through a separate company under a different name. It goes live next week. Agent Williams raised an eyebrow. You continued a billion-dollar project while working as a dishwasher? You'd be amazed what you can do with a laptop. And public library Wi-Fi. Marcus smiled. Besides, I had inspiration. His eyes met Sarah's again. Someone showed me why it really mattered. Sarah thought of their late-night conversations about healthcare costs, about families choosing between medicine and food. He'd been listening, really listening, even while carrying the weight of his own crisis. An agent's radio crackled. Davidson was in custody. The evidence was overwhelming. It was over. Marcus stood, straightening his tie. Press conference in an hour. Time to clear my name officially. The FBI team filed out, leaving them alone. Sarah studied the man before her, designer suit and confident posture, but with dishwasher's calluses still fresh on his hands. Why did you want me here for this? She asked. Because you deserve to know it wasn't all a lie. That while I was James the dishwasher, I was also fighting for something bigger. Something that might help people like your mother. And now, Now that you're Marcus Chen again? He stepped closer. Now I'm both. The billionaire who remembers the value of a $27 tip. The tech mogul who learned more about humanity from a small-town diner than from any corporate boardroom. He paused. A man who fell in love with a waitress who saw him at his most real, even when she didn't know who he was. The word love hung in the air between them, as honest as the dishes he'd washed, as real as the kindness she'd shown a stranger. The media circus outside Joe's diner had grown into a full carnival. Reporters crowded the sidewalk, cameras flashing every time the door opened. Inside, Sarah watched through the blinds as Marcus gave another statement, his corporate mask firmly in place. "I can't believe you were serving coffee to a billionaire," Ruby said for the 100th time, peering over Sarah's shoulder. "And he was washing dishes. Our dishes." But Sarah wasn't listening. She was thinking about the text message on her phone. "Meet me at our usual spot after closing. One last time before everything changes." The hospital had called earlier. Her mother was responding well to the treatment, stable enough to demand updates about that nice dishwasher boy. The news coverage of Davidson's arrest played on every channel, each report more sensational than the last. Mill Creek had become the unlikely center of a national story. "You should go," Jerry said gruffly, appearing beside her. "Man might be worth billions, but he still makes a lousy dishwasher." Sarah smiled despite herself. "You knew, didn't you? Something was off about him. Nobody that rich learns to work that hard overnight." Jerry shrugged. "But he tried. For you, he tried." Outside, Marcus was finishing his statement. "While the investigation continues, I want to thank the people of Mill Creek, especially the staff of Joe's Diner, for showing me what real community looks like." The reporters shouted questions. "Mr. Chen, what about the waitress? Is it true you fell in love while in hiding? Will you be staying in Mill Creek?" Sarah watched him deflect each question with practiced ease, so different from the quiet man who'd shared soup with her after closing. Yet something in his eyes, a certain softness when he glanced toward the diner, reminded her of James. Her phone buzzed again. "I understand if you don't come, but I hope you will." As the crowd dispersed and darkness fell, Sarah found herself staying behind even after Ruby and Jerry left. The diner felt different now, too quiet, too heavy with memories. She made 2 cups of coffee out of habit, then realized she was still using the chipped mug Marcus had claimed as his own. The bell chimed softly. Marcus entered, loosening his tie, looking exhausted. Without a word, he took his usual seat at the counter. "I wasn't sure you'd really come," Sarah said, sliding his coffee across the counter. "I wasn't sure you'd stay." He took a sip, grimacing slightly. "I forgot how bad this coffee really is," says the man who asked for 3 refills every night. They shared a small smile, and for a moment, it was almost like before, almost. "I'm leaving for New York tomorrow," Marcus said finally. "The board meeting, the formal reinstatement. I have to clean up Davidson's mess." Sarah nodded, ignoring the tightness in her chest. "Back to your real life." "That's just it." He reached across the counter, taking her hand. "This feels more real than anything waiting for me in New York. These past weeks, being James, working here, knowing you, I finally remembered who I was, before the money, before the power. Someone who wanted to help people, who believed in something bigger than profit margins. And now I have a choice. We both do." He squeezed her hand. "Come with me." Sarah pulled back, startled. "To New York, just to visit. See my world, like I've seen yours. Then," he took a deep breath, "then we decide, together, about everything." Through the window they could see the last news van pulling away, leaving Main Street as quiet as any normal night in Mill Creek. But nothing would ever be normal again. Not after James. Not after Marcus. "And if I say no," Sarah asked softly, "if I'm not ready to step into Marcus Chen's world, then I'll find a way to make my world fit into Mill Creek, because the man I am with you, that's who I want to be. New York City stretched out below Marcus's penthouse office like a glittering chessboard, each light representing a move yet to be made. Sarah stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her diner uniform replaced by a simple blue dress that somehow made her look both out of place and perfectly at home in this world of glass and steel. "The board meeting is tomorrow," Marcus said, watching her reflection in the window. "Davidson's colleagues don't know yet that we have evidence of their involvement. They're expecting to vote me out permanently." And instead, Sarah turned to face him, still adjusting to this version of Marcus, the corporate warrior in his natural habitat. "Instead, they'll learn what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness." He loosened his tie, a gesture that reminded her of James after a long shift. "The FBI is ready. The SEC has the documents. Even my old friend Thomas is prepared to testify." Sarah picked up a framed photo from his desk, a younger Marcus with his parents on their farm. "You've been planning this for weeks, haven't you? Even while washing dishes?" Every night after closing, he moved to stand beside her. The diner was perfect cover. Who'd suspect a dishwasher of orchestrating a corporate takeback? The door opened, and Marcus's security chief entered with a tablet. "Sir, Davidson's talking. Says he has evidence that board member Phillips was the mastermind." "He's lying," Marcus replied, eyes narrowing. "Phillips was involved, but this goes higher. Check Davidson's offshore accounts for transactions linked to MedTech Global." Sarah watched the interchange, seeing both sides of Marcus now, the shrewd businessman and the man who'd shared soup with her after midnight shifts. The man who'd listened to her dreams and seen value in them beyond their profit potential. "What about the healthcare AI?" she asked suddenly. "The one they tried to stop?" Marcus smiled, pulling up a projection on the wall. Complex code scrolled. Past, but at its heart was a simple interface, one that could help patients understand their options, predict costs, find affordable treatments. "It goes live the same moment I walk into that boardroom," he said. "They tried to bury it because it would cut into their profit margins, but sometimes," he glanced at Sarah, "sometimes the right thing is worth more than money." Her mother's face flashed in her mind. Elena growing stronger each day, thanks to the treatment they could now afford. How many other families could this system help? A notification popped up on Marcus's phone. Davidson's complete confession, recorded by the FBI, the final piece they needed. "You should get some rest," Sarah said, noting the fatigue in Marcus's eyes. "Tomorrow will be intense." "Stay," he said suddenly, "not just for tomorrow, not just to see how this ends." He took her hands in his. "Help me rebuild this company into something that actually helps people. Your perspective, your understanding of what real people need, it's worth more than all the MBA consultants in New York." Sarah felt the weight of the moment. Below them, the city pulsed with energy and possibility. Behind them, the computer displayed the healthcare system that could change millions of lives. "And what about the diner?" she asked softly. "What about Mill Creek?" "I was thinking," Marcus said, pulling up another projection. "Architectural plans for a building on Maple Street. Every corporate headquarters needs a good cafe nearby, one that serves real food, real coffee, run by someone who understands the value of both kindness and hard work." Sarah's breath caught as she recognized her own designs, her dream cafe, expanded and enhanced, but still essentially hers. "You don't have to decide now," Marcus added quickly. "Tomorrow we face the board. We expose the corruption. We launch the AI. After that," he squeezed her hands, "after that we write our own story, together or apart, but honestly this time, no more disguises." Outside, a storm was gathering over the city, lightning flickering between skyscrapers. Like nature's own corporate war, tomorrow would bring either victory or ruin, redemption or defeat. But tonight, in an office high above the city, a former waitress and a not-so-former dishwasher held onto each other, proving that sometimes the greatest acts of revolution start with the smallest acts of kindness. The Chen Innovations boardroom felt like a gladiator arena, dressed in mahogany and leather. Sarah watched from a side office as executives filed in, their designer suits and practice smiles masking predatory intent. Each face matched photos. Marcus had shown her, players in a conspiracy that had nearly destroyed him. "They're all here," Marcus's security chief murmured into his earpiece. "Davidson's confession has been distributed to the FBI and SEC agents waiting downstairs." Marcus stood before a mirror, adjusting his tie. The gesture reminded Sarah of how he used to straighten his apron before busy shifts. "Having second thoughts about staying?" he asked, catching her reflection. "No," she replied, moving to fix his tie herself. "But I am wondering how many of them ever worked as dishwashers." His laugh broke the tension. "None. That's their weakness. They've forgotten what it means to build something with their own hands." Through the glass walls, they could see Phillips, the board member Davidson had tried to frame as the mastermind, holding court among his allies. His confidence would be his downfall. Marcus's team had traced the largest transactions to his private accounts. "Mr. Chen," his assistant called softly. "They're ready." Before Marcus could move, Sarah caught his arm. "Wait." She pulled something from her bag, the chipped coffee mug from the diner. "For luck and to remember who you really are." His eyes softened as he took the mug. The dishwasher who fell in love with a waitress? The man who saw value in people, not just profits. The boardroom hushed as Marcus entered, carrying the incongruous diner mug. Sarah watched through the glass as he took his place at the head of the table, every inch the returning CEO, yet somehow different, stronger, more grounded. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the quiet authority she'd first noticed in a homeless stranger's politeness. "Before we vote on my future with this company, I want to share a story about a diner, a waitress, and a lesson in true value." Phillips smirked, leaning back. "We're not here for fairy tales, Marcus." "No." Marcus set the coffee mug deliberately on the polished table. "Then let's talk about numbers. Specifically the $8 billion that disappeared through a network of shell companies, or perhaps the offshore accounts you thought were untraceable." The smirk faltered. Other board members shifted uncomfortably. "While you were following false trails across Europe and Asia," Marcus continued, "I was learning something valuable. In a small-town diner, I saw how real people struggle with healthcare costs, how they choose between medicine and food. I watched a waitress count tips to pay for her mother's treatment, while you," he looked directly at Phillips, "were burying an AI system that could have helped millions just to protect your investments in overpriced healthcare companies." Screens around the room lit up, displaying transaction records, encrypted emails, Davidson's confession. The evidence was overwhelming. "The vote today isn't about my future," Marcus said, his voice hardening. "It's about yours. The FBI is currently taking statements from Davidson. The SEC has frozen all suspicious accounts. And in exactly 1 minute, our healthcare AI goes live across the country." Phillips stood abruptly. "You can't." "I already have." Marcus lifted the diner mug in a mock toast. "You tried to destroy me because I threatened your profits. Instead, you taught me the true cost of forgetting our humanity." Sarah felt tears in her eyes as she watched the scene unfold. FBI agents entered the boardroom, leading Phillips and 3 other board members away. The healthcare AI launched without a hitch, its interface designed to be simple enough for anyone to use, even a waitress helping her sick mother navigate treatment options. Through the chaos of arrests and reporters gathering outside, Marcus maintained his calm center. He'd learned that in Mill Creek, Sarah realized. Learned it serving others, doing honest work, being simply human. Later, after the dust had settled and the boardroom emptied, Sarah found Marcus standing at the windows. The city stretched below. In them, but his eyes were on the small coffee mug. "You know," he said without turning, "I never thought my greatest corporate victory would come from learning to wash dishes." Sarah moved to stand beside him. "And I never thought falling in love would start with an act of kindness to a stranger." He turned to her then, and in his eyes she saw both the billionaire CEO and the humble dishwasher, finally, perfectly merged. "Into one authentic self, ready to change the world?" he asked, offering his hand. Sarah took it, feeling the calluses that matched her own. One cup of coffee at a time. The next 24 hours unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony of justice and redemption. Marcus stood in the center of Chen Innovation's main conference room, now transformed into a command center for federal investigators. Screens displayed real-time data as the healthcare AI system went live across the country, while others tracked the unraveling of the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed him. Sarah watched from her position beside Elena's hospital bed, where they'd set up a laptop to follow the events. Her mother's doctors had already begun using the new AI system, marveling at how it simplified treatment plans and cost calculations. "Your dishwasher did all this?" Elena asked, watching Marcus address a crowd of reporters on the live feed. "No. Wonder he was terrible at cleaning pots." But Sarah's attention was drawn to a different screen, where FBI agents were leading Phillips from his home in handcuffs. The man's arrogant facade had crumbled, replaced by desperate anger. As they placed him in the car, he looked directly at the camera and mouthed two words: "Not finished." Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Something's wrong. Phillips is too calm. Check the diner." Her heart stopped. Jerry had opened early today, despite the media circus, saying Mill Creek needed its coffee regardless of billionaire drama. She tried calling the diner, but there was no answer. "Mama, I have to go," Elena insisted, already reaching for her own phone to call the nurses. Sarah broke every speed limit between the hospital and the diner. As she turned onto Main Street, she saw them, 3 men in expensive suits entering Joe's through the back door. Not reporters, not customers. She called Marcus. "They're here, Phillips's private security team. Sarah, don't—" But she was already pulling into the parking lot. Through the diner's windows, she could see Jerry and Ruby frozen behind the counter, while men in suits methodically searched the kitchen. They were looking for something Phillips must have hidden during his secret meetings with Davidson. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for the door handle, but then she remembered something Marcus had told her during their late-night conversations. In business, like in diners, knowledge is power. But kindness is unexpected. Use it. She straightened her waitress uniform and walked in. "Welcome to Joe's," she announced cheerfully, making every head turn. "Coffee?" The lead man's hand moved toward his jacket, but Sarah was already behind the counter, reaching for cups. "Jerry, these gentlemen look like they could use your special blend. The one you saved for important guests." Jerry's eyes widened slightly, understanding. The special blend was their code for trouble. It triggered a silent alarm to the police. "You," one of the men finally recognized her from the news. "You're Chen's waitress." "Actually," Sarah kept her voice steady, "I'm just a waitress who served a dishwasher. Coffee?" She could see confusion in their faces. They were used to dealing with corporate threats, not small-town diner staff who offered coffee to intruders. "The evidence," the leader demanded. "Phillips said Davidson hid a drive here." "Where?" Sarah thought quickly. Davidson had been a regular during his meetings with Phillips, always sitting in booth 3, always complaining about the wobbly table. The bell chimed as more people entered, locals, drawn by the unusual scene. Mill Creek might be small, but its people looked after their own. "Maybe," Sarah suggested, buying time, "you should order something, draw less attention. We have great soup." She saw one of the men touch his earpiece, heard him whisper, "Too many witnesses." That's when Marcus walked in. He looked nothing like the CEO from the morning news. He'd shed his suit jacket, rolled up his sleeves. He looked like James the dishwasher. "Ready for a shift, gentlemen," he said calmly. "I believe you're sitting in my booth." The leader drew his weapon, but faster than anyone could react, Ruby's coffee pot shattered against his hand. Jerry vaulted the counter with surprising agility for his size. And through the kitchen door came Thomas and an FBI tactical team. "Right," as local police cars screeched into the parking lot. "The drive," Marcus said as the men were being cuffed, "is already in FBI custody. Davidson didn't hide it under the table. He gave it to someone he thought was a homeless man, someone he didn't. Look at twice, me." Sarah felt her knees go weak as the adrenaline faded. Marcus caught her arm, steadying her. "You know," he said softly, "most people run away from armed men, not toward them. Most people don't fall in love with undercover billionaires. Most billionaires don't fall in love with small-town waitresses who teach them what really matters." The diner erupted in cheers and applause, their regular customers, their community, celebrating not just the drama's end, but the triumph of their own. Jerry gruffly announced free coffee for everyone, while Ruby began regaling the FBI agents with her theories about Marcus's true identity. Through the windows, they could see news vans arriving, drawn by the commotion. "Phillips will talk now," Thomas reported, securing the scene. "The whole conspiracy's unraveling. Healthcare AI is already helping thousands. Stock prices soaring. The board's calling for an emergency meeting to reinstate you fully." But Marcus wasn't listening. He was looking at the dish sink where his journey had started. "You know what I don't miss," he mused. "That garbage disposal. Pretty sure it was trying to kill me." Sarah laughed, feeling the last of the tension dissolve. "You face down corporate conspiracies and armed thugs, but you're afraid of a garbage disposal? Hey, you try sticking your hands in there 3 times a day." Through the kitchen door, they could hear the FBI teams completing their sweep, securing evidence, taking statements. The diner would be a crime scene for a while, then a tourist attraction probably. But right now, in this moment, it was just theirs. "So," Marcus said, picking up a coffee pot, "think a CEO remembers how to pour a decent cup?" Sarah smiled, reaching for cups. "Only one way to find out." Together, they served coffee to FBI agents, local police, and regular customers, moving in the same comfortable rhythm they'd developed over those quiet weeks. He might be Marcus Chen, billionaire CEO to the rest of the world, but here in this diner, he was still just James, the dishwasher who'd learned to see true value in a cup of coffee and an act of kindness. As the sun set over Mill Creek, painting the diner in familiar golden light, Sarah looked around at their gathered community, Jerry pretending not to be impressed by the FBI's praise of his quick thinking, Ruby dramatically reenacting her coffee pot heroics, locals sharing their versions of events with reporters. This was her world, but now it was Marcus's too, just as his world of corporate power and global change had become partly hers. "Ready for tomorrow?" Marcus asked, refilling her cup with surprisingly professional skill. "You mean facing the board, running a cafe empire, or just being the waitress who tamed a billionaire?" "I was thinking more about our regular late-night coffee," he smiled. "Some habits are worth keeping." Sarah leaned against him, feeling the perfect rightness of this moment. "All the good ones are." 6 months later, the bell above the door chimed at Sarah's cafe on Maple Street. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows, highlighting the carefully preserved Joe's Diner sign mounted on the exposed brick wall, a reminder of where their story began. Eleanor sat at the counter, her health fully restored, carefully teaching one of the new waitresses the proper way to fold napkins. "Like this, dear. Presentation matters as much as the food." The cafe had become Mill Creek's art, a perfect blend of small-town charm and modern efficiency. The healthcare AI terminal in the corner, one of thousands now operating across the country, helped dozens of families each week navigate their medical choices. Sarah had insisted on installing the first one here, saying every revolution needed a hometown. The kitchen doors swung open as Marcus emerged, wearing a crisp business suit but with an apron tied over it. "Board meeting in an hour," he announced, sliding a cup of coffee across the counter to Sarah. "But the dishes are done." "A billionaire CEO who still does dishes." Ruby marveled from her usual spot. She'd followed Sarah to the new cafe, saying she couldn't miss the next chapter of this story. "Now I've seen everything. Some skills are worth keeping." Marcus smiled, his hands bearing fresh calluses from his weekly shifts. He'd made it a point to keep washing dishes once a week, saying it kept him grounded. The business magazines called it eccentric. Mill Creek called it right. Sarah took a sip of the coffee. Perfect, as always. On the wall behind her hung a shadow box containing a chipped mug and a framed receipt for $27.13. Beside it, newspaper headlines told their story. Tech billionaires, healthcare AI revolutionizes treatment access. Phillips pleads guilty in corporate conspiracy. And her favorite, From Dishes to Riches, a small-town love story. The new cafe opens in Chicago next week, Sarah said, reviewing their expansion plans. Each location would feature the same blend of community space and healthcare resources, with local owners who understood their community's needs. Ready to wash dishes in the Windy City? As long as you're serving the coffee, Marcus replied, kissing her softly. The door chimed again as Jerry entered. He'd finally retired from Joe's, but insisted on checking that they were doing things right at least once a day. The morning regulars followed, creating the comfortable buzz of community that no corporate consultant could replicate. This was their real triumph, Sarah realized, not just exposing corruption or launching successful businesses, but proving that two worlds could merge, that kindness could scale, that love could begin with a simple act of generosity and grow into something that changed lives. "Time for your meeting," she reminded Marcus, straightening his tie one last time. He nodded, removing the apron. "Save me some soup?" "Always," she smiled. "After all, some habits are worth keeping forever." In the gentle morning light, their two worlds had become one, built on a foundation of fresh coffee, clean dishes, and the endless power of unexpected kindness.